I've had quite a few messages on Dillian Whyte versus Kubrat Pulev, so I thought I'd record something briefly just to put a few thoughts out on it. Looks like the two fighters are going to have to fight each other for an IBF final eliminator or something of that nature. Interesting that Dillian Whyte would go down that route, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about him being the WBC #1 rated fighter, and you know, Dillian potentially being in line to fight Deontay Wilder for that version of the heavyweight world title. So slightly unexpected to see him progressing down the IBF route from my perspective. Obviously, if he were to become IBF mandatory, that would be to Anthony Joshua, and that's a fight that you kind of suspected that Hearn and Joshua would look to make anyway from a mandatory. From a Kubrat Pulev perspective, you know, Pulev has kind of got an odd career, really. He lost to Vladimir Klitschko back in 2014. You know, it's now 2018. It feels like a long time ago. Since then, he had 2 fights against journeyman in 2015. He fought Chisora and the corpse, the ghost of Samuel Peter in 2016. And in 2017, we had the bizarre Anthony Joshua pull out, and then one fight against the ghost of Kevin Johnson. You know, now Kubrat Pulev, 36 years old, and really at a point where he's talked about less and less frequently by boxing fans in the context of today's heavyweight division. On his day, Kubrat Pulev is a very, very good fighter, accomplished amateur, one of the better jabs at the heavyweight division, you know, a true technician. Look at the way he handled Derek Chisora in 2016 when they fought. I appreciate that was a split decision because one of the judges inexplicably thought Derek Chisora won the fight, but really that was quite a comfortable win for Kubrat Pulev that night, and he showed that he still had, you know, a lot to offer in today's heavyweight division. He certainly beat Derek Chisora a hell of a lot easier for my money than Dillian Whyte did, although I would acknowledge that Dillian Whyte and Kubrat Pulev have very, very big differences between them, so it may be a case of styles making fights. You know, from a Dillian Whyte perspective, I'm not 1,000,000% sure that this fight adds up from a risk-reward ratio. I mean, Whyte's in a very, very good place already to try and get a voluntary against Joshua or a mandatory against Deontay Wilder. So, you know, if you're looking at it from a pure business perspective, does Dillian Whyte want to gamble the position that he's currently in for a fight against Kubrat Pulev? You know, if he were to win, people would say Kubrat Pulev has passed it, Kubrat Pulev's been inactive, you know, Kubrat Pulev got smashed out by Vladimir Klitschko, and it's probably not the biggest money fight out there for Dillian Whyte. You know, Kubrat Pulev, Dillian Whyte is certainly not a pay-per-view fight. I can't see that being a fight that sells out arenas, etc. So, you know, from a Dillian Whyte perspective, it's an odd fight. And from a Kubrat Pulev perspective, you know, I think Pulev's profile generally is of a sort of odd guy. You kind of get the perspective that he could have fought Anthony Joshua in the past if he'd so wished. And does he now want to fight a final eliminator for the chance to fight Anthony Joshua? You know, it's kind of an odd situation. It's a fight that, for me, has a lot of risk factors attached to it, and I wouldn't be completely amazed if it's a fight that we don't see happen, you know, for one reason or another. But in terms of what would happen if the two guys do step into the ring, interesting. At their best, I think Kubrat Pulev is clearly a better fighter than Dillian Whyte, and I would predict, at their best, Kubrat Pulev should outpoint Dillian Whyte. I think Pulev is too smart with his boxing fundamentals, too smart with his jab for a guy like Dillian Whyte, who can be quite wild, quite wide, quite raw with some of his work still. Having said that, boxing's all about momentum, boxing's all about timing, and Kubrat Pulev has one of the least, in terms of his heavyweight profile, of the top contenders, he has probably got the least momentum. You know, by the time he fights Dillian Whyte, he'll have been out of the ring for, what, 15, 16, 17 months. You know, he won't have fought a live body for well over 2 years. He'll be 37 years old, you know, possibly in the autumn of his career. Whereas you look at a guy like Dillian Whyte, who put in a career peak performance for me last time out. And whilst the Lucas Brown that Dillian Whyte was up against was a long way away from a peak Lucas Brown, in that fight, Dillian Whyte showed real advantages and real for me, improvements in terms of some of the combinations he was throwing, some of the speed, some of the selection of punches. I thought it was a much more mature performance from Dillian Whyte, whilst retaining some of those Dillian Whyte flaws that we kind of always know are going to be in his game at this stage. So, yeah, from my perspective, it could be a tight fight. You also would assume it's the kind of fight where if Kubrat Pulev was going to win, he'd have to win in a sort of points decision where he slightly outsmarted and slightly outworked Dillian Whyte. And, you know, coming to the UK, fighting Dillian Whyte on a show where Dillian Whyte is the home promoted fighter in front of a pro Dillian Whyte crowd could be difficult in terms of getting a decision. You know, Kubrat Pulev would have to be coming over with a view to really doing a number on Dillian Whyte if he was planning to win the fight on points. You don't suspect Dillian Whyte has you know, you suspect Dillian Whyte's got the durability to last against Pulev. You look at Pulev as well, you've got to say that in Pulev's entire career, he's only really been up against one guy who was an elite level fighter at the time they fought. And he's only been up against one guy who's been a notable puncher. You know, and that's obviously Vladimir Klitschko. And when Klitschko did fight against Kubrat Pulev, you know, Klitschko made very, very, very light work of him and, you know, had him hurt several times before a sort of early to middle stoppage. So it's not completely out of the question that just like Dillian Whyte was able to hurt Lucas Browne, that Dillian Whyte could potentially hurt a guy like Kubrat Pulev. You know, Pulev has shown some vulnerabilities there before. So in summary, do I think the fight will happen? I think there's enough risk factors to be dubious, although, you know, it does look to be, listening to the stories, listening to the commentary out there, it does look to be that the fight is potentially in the direction of being made. From a pure boxing perspective, you have to give Kubrat Pulev big advantages. But from a momentum perspective, and from being the home promoted fighter, the younger fighter, the more active fighter, you have to give Dillian Whyte a lot of advantages. Right now, and I don't believe I'm saying this, right now I'd almost be inclined to side with Dillian Whyte in the fight, in what I believe would be a 50-50 fight. You know, look at what happened with Lucas Browne. Look at what happened with Robert Helenius. You know, these are guys who were one time much hyped guys. They'd got on a bit, they'd had a few knocks in their careers, they'd lost that activity, they hadn't been fighting at the level they'd been fighting at earlier on in their careers. You know, Kubrat Pulev, another one of those, and he's coming up against a guy in Dillian Whyte who, whilst he's no world beater whatsoever, is an improving fighter, and a fighter who, you know, carries a level of power, is certainly quite durable, and would have the crowd and home promotion behind him, let's put it that way. As for Kubrat Pulev, yeah, if Kubrat Pulev rocked up at his very best, could he come and 12-0 Dillian Whyte? Could he come and absolutely take Dillian Whyte to school? You know, outmove him, make him miss, jab his head off, counter him, time him. It's very possible. It's very possible. But for me, despite being a good fighter at his best, Kubrat Pulev has always been someone who I've considered potentially frail. And Whyte, for me, possibly would have enough to edge past him in a tight fight. I believe Kubrat Pulev may be the kind of guy who can be broken, and I think with the high output approach that Whyte would bring in the fight and walking down Kubrat Pulev, I think it would make Pulev uncomfortable, and I just think there'd be enough risk factors attached to Pulev and enough pro points attached to Dillian Whyte that I'd almost edge towards Dillian Whyte in what I consider a 50-50 fight. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have gone Kubrat Pulev quite confidently. But a year is a long time in boxing. At 37 years old, lacking that activity, having a few dubious circumstances in his career, you know, Kubrat Pulev has risk factors attached to him, whereas Dillian Whyte has continued to remain very, very active for a heavyweight. He's continued to step up the level of opposition. He's continued to improve, and we'll see if the fight actually happens. There's reasons why Dillian Whyte wouldn't want the fight. Kubrat Pulev's profile has been taking you know, if you look at his modus operandi, he's more likely to fight a 50-year-old former boxer next time out. So there's reasons the fight won't happen. Actually, a very, very interesting fight if it does happen from a styles perspective. You know, maybe not the glitz and the glamour of an AJ Parker or a Wilder Ortiz, but potentially an interesting fight. And I think I'd go as far as to say it would be the most significant win of either guy's career, actually, if they were to beat each other. Let me know your take. Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit subscribe. If you're new, please hit the thumbs up button. Thanks.